The city had always been cruel, but now it felt hollow, as if something had rotted beneath its streets and spread through every crumbling building, every flickering street lamp, every set of eyes that refused to meet his. Eli Harris had been gone long enough to forget how the weight of home could settle into his bones, but now it was back, pressing against his ribs with every step. He moved through the streets with a deliberate calm, his dark skin blending into the night, his hood low, his senses sharp. He had seen war in places the world tried to forget, had learned how to read danger in the twitch of a hand, the shift of a stance, the silence before an attack. This wasn't war. This was personal. The building hadn't changed. The paint still peeled, the numbers on the doors still clung stubbornly to rusted metal, and the air still carried the faint scent of old wood and cooking grease. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his breath steady, his hands loose but ready. The moment he stepped inside, he saw her. Miriam Harris sat in her chair, spine straight, hands resting lightly on her lap, her expression carefully composed. But the bruises stood out like ink on paper, deep along her cheekbone, shadowed beneath her eye, blooming in places she didn't bother to hide. The room was silent except for the quiet hum of the heater, the distant sound of a television from another apartment, the faint rustle of fabric as she shifted. His body tensed. He had spent years training himself to control his reactions, to push emotion aside and focus on action, but this was different. This was his mother. She had never been weak, had never backed down, had never let the city tell her who she could be. But strength didn't stop fists. It didn't stop boots. It didn't stop the kind of men who thought power was something you took with violence. His gaze swept the room, searching for signs of what he already knew. The teacup in her hands, still half full, the book resting beside her chair, the way her fingers hovered just above the pages as if she couldn't quite bring herself to touch them. She hadn't told him to come. She never would have. But she had called, and that was enough. He lowered himself onto the couch, elbows on his knees, exhaling slowly, grounding himself in the moment. The rage was there, simmering beneath the surface, controlled but alive. He let it settle, let it sit in his chest like something waiting to be unleashed, but not yet. Not yet. She didn't look at him right away. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup, slow, methodical, her breathing even. Outside, a car passed, headlights flashing briefly through the curtains before darkness swallowed them again. He followed the movement of her hand, the way her nails tapped lightly against the ceramic, the way the tendons in her wrist tensed with just a little more force than necessary. The bruises on her knuckles hadn't come from falling. She had fought back. A slow inhale, steady, controlled. His fingers curled against his palms. She finally lifted her gaze, meeting his with the quiet steel he had known his entire life. No weakness, no fear, only a tired kind of knowing. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. His mother had spent her life in this city. She knew the weight of its silence, the names that carried power, the ones that could make a report disappear before it was even filed. The ones who made sure justice was something that belonged to the highest bidder. His mind was already moving through the steps, calculating, planning, dismantling. She shifted slightly, the movement small but enough for a wince to betray itself in the lines of her face. His jaw tightened. The walls felt too thin, the air too heavy, the space between them filled with the weight of something inevitable. He stood. The chair creaked slightly as he moved, the wood protesting against years of use. She didn't speak, didn't try to stop him. There was no need. She had called. That was all it took. Eli moved like a shadow through the city, his dark skin blending into the dimly lit alleys and forgotten streets where power was measured not by money or influence but by fear. He had spent his life learning to read people, understanding that the difference between survival and death wasn't strength but knowledge, and right now, knowledge was his weapon. The streets spoke if you knew how to listen, and Eli had spent years learning their language. He started with the barbershops, the liquor stores, the late-night diners where men gathered to talk in whispers they thought no one could hear, where loyalty was paper-thin and information was always for sale. The gang that had attacked his mother called themselves the Fangs, a group of reckless men who had grown too bold under the protection of the city's true power, but power always had weak spots. He found his first lead in a rundown convenience store where a nervous kid with a twitchy leg and too much sweat on his brow let a name slip before realizing he had spoken too fast. Manny. That was all Eli needed. Manny was the kind of man who thought fear made him untouchable, a coward who hid behind numbers. But when Eli found him, he was alone, leaning against a rusted car behind an abandoned auto shop, his cigarette glowing in the dark, his breath steady because he had no idea that his night was about to end badly. Eli moved fast, no wasted motion, one hand clamping around Manny's throat as he slammed him against the metal with enough force to rattle the frame. The cigarette hit the ground, sparks scattering like dying fireflies, Manny's hands scrambling at Eli's wrist, his mouth opening in a breathless choke, but Eli only tightened his grip. "Who sent you?" The words were calm, too calm, the kind of quiet that let a man know he had made a mistake. Manny shook his head, his fingers digging into Eli's arm, his body twisting in a useless attempt to break free, but Eli was unmovable. He loosened his grip just enough to let the man gasp for air before slamming his fist into his ribs, feeling the crunch of cartilage, the choked sound of pain, the sudden realization in Manny's eyes that this wasn't a warning. "Oh, so you?" This time, the words came with another strike, sharp and precise, a methodical dismantling of a man who had never had to face real consequences. The name finally fell from his lips between ragged breaths. Moreno. Eli already knew, but hearing it made it real. He let Manny collapse to the ground, coughing and spitting blood onto the pavement, his body trembling as he looked up at the man who had just broken him without breaking a sweat. "Tell your people," Eli said, his voice low, unshaken. "This city belongs to my mother. Anyone who forgets that answers to me." And then he walked away, leaving Manny in the dirt, a warning painted in bruises and blood. But warnings meant nothing to men who thought they owned the world. That night, they came for his mother, 4 of them, their faces masked, their weapons drawn, thinking they could send a message, thinking they could make Eli back down. They didn't know he had been waiting. The first fell before he even reached the porch, his knee shattered by a precise strike, his body hitting the pavement with a scream. The second swung a bat, wild and desperate, but Eli caught it mid-motion, ripped it from his grip, and sent him sprawling with a brutal kick to the chest. The last 2 hesitated, their confidence breaking, their leader already groaning on the ground, and then they ran, leaving their wounded behind. Eli let them go. He wanted them afraid. The next morning, Sheriff Blake came knocking, his uniform crisp, his eyes lazy with the arrogance of a man who had never had to enforce real justice. "You're stirring up trouble," he said, his voice smooth, rehearsed, the voice of a man who had made a career out of keeping men like Moreno happy. "You should leave while you still can." Eli didn't answer right away, just watched him, measured him, let the silence stretch until Blake shifted his weight just slightly, discomfort flickering beneath his confidence. Then Eli smiled, slow and sharp. "Not until it's finished." The message reached Moreno before the sun set. The man who had built his empire on fear, who had controlled the city for longer than Eli had been alive, sat in his high-rise, his expression unreadable as he listened to the report. Then, without looking up, he gave the order. "Kill him." The night swallowed the city in thick shadows, neon lights flickering like dying stars, the hum of distant traffic masking the quiet movements of men who thought they had control. Eli felt them before he saw them, the weight of their presence pressing against the narrow alley walls, the silent anticipation of a trap closing around him. He didn't stop walking, didn't show hesitation, but his mind calculated every detail, the uneven pavement beneath his boots, the flickering street lamp to his left, the faint shift of movement above. The fangs weren't smart, but they were desperate, and desperate men made mistakes. The first strike came from the right, a figure lunging from the shadows, a knife flashing under the dim light, but Eli had already moved, his body twisting, his hands striking with precise brutality. The blade missed, the attacker's arm bent the wrong way with a sickening snap, his scream cut short by a swift elbow to the temple. 2 more closed in from behind, one swinging a pipe, the other drawing a gun. Eli ducked low, his foot driving into the first man's knee, sending him crumbling with a broken scream. The second barely had time to pull the trigger before Eli's fist crashed into his wrist, forcing the barrel skyward, the gunshot ripping into the night but hitting nothing. A second strike to the throat ended the fight before it began. Silence. The fangs had underestimated him. That was their first mistake. Their second was thinking he wouldn't come for them. He didn't give them time to regroup. He tracked them back to their hideout, a rundown warehouse reeking of sweat, blood, and stale beer, a place where power was measured in scars and loyalty was sold for the right price. He moved through the darkness like a ghost, his steps silent, his breath controlled. The first guard barely had time to register the shadow before the steel of Eli's knife slid between his ribs. The second fell just as fast, his body crumpling against the wall before he could cry out. Inside, a dozen men sat around a table, their laughter sharp, their confidence unshaken. That changed when the first Molotov hit the ground, flames licking hungrily at the rotting wood, smoke curling into the air like a vengeful spirit. Panic shattered their bravado, guns drawn too late, bodies scrambling for escape. Eli moved fast, cutting through them with ruthless precision, each strike calculated, each bullet fired only when necessary. By the time the fire consumed the walls, only one man was left breathing, pinned beneath Eli's knee, his face smeared with blood and terror. "Who owns you?" The man choked, coughed, tried to look away, but Eli pressed harder, the cold steel of a blade resting against his throat. "Moreno," he gasped. "It's all Moreno." The name wasn't new, but the documents Eli found inside the burning hideout were. Pages of coded transactions, lists of shipments, names he recognized and names he didn't, but one thing was clear, Moreno wasn't just another crime boss. He was connected to something bigger. Eli scanned the pages, his fingers tightening around the edges. The shipments weren't just local. They stretched beyond the city, beyond the borders, linking back to a cartel with a reach deeper than he had anticipated. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about stopping something far worse. He needed help. Rob Gardner hadn't worn a badge in years, but the fire in his eyes hadn't faded. Eli found him in a dimly lit bar, the weight of his past pressing into his slouched shoulders, the ghosts of lost battles flickering behind his stare. He didn't look surprised to see Eli. He listened, the glass in his hand barely touched, his fingers tapping against the worn counter as Eli laid out everything: Moreno, the cartel, the corruption that had rotted the city to its bones. When Eli was finished, Rob exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting to the empty street outside. "I tried once," he said, his voice rough with the weight of failure. "It cost me everything." Eli met his stare, unwavering. "Then let's make sure it wasn't for nothing." A long silence stretched between them before Rob nodded. They worked fast, gathering evidence, piecing together the web of lies that stretched from the lowest street thug to the highest office. The sheriff's name appeared again and again, his fingerprints all over every deal, every cover-up, every crime swept under the rug. But proof wasn't enough. They needed something bigger, something that couldn't be buried under threats and money. And then, finally, they found it. A warehouse, not just any warehouse, but the warehouse. The shipments, the weapons, the drugs, all of it. If they took it down, they wouldn't just hurt Moreno. They would cripple him. But Moreno wasn't a man who let his empire crumble without a fight. And Eli knew, when he made his move, the war would truly begin. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its skeletal metal frame barely visible against the thick mist rolling in from the docks. Eli crouched behind a stack of abandoned shipping crates, his breath steady, his pulse slow, his hands tightening around the detonator in his grip. He had spent the last 3 nights tracking the shipments, memorizing security rotations, pinpointing the weak spots in Moreno's operation. This was where the drugs moved through the city, where money and power traded hands in whispered deals, where corrupt cops turned a blind eye in exchange for fat envelopes. That ended tonight. The explosives were in place, charges strapped to the main supply crates, nestled between pounds of product worth millions. He exhaled, his finger hovering over the trigger, the weight of the moment pressing against him like the still air before a storm. Then he pressed it. The explosion tore through the night, a thunderous roar splitting the silence, fire and debris erupting into the sky like a violent exorcism. The ground shook beneath him, flames swallowing everything in their path, metal groaning as the shockwave rippled through the structure. Shouts rang out, figures scrambling in panic, the flickering orange glow illuminating their confusion, their fear. Eli didn't wait. He moved, slipping through the chaos like a phantom, his silhouette blending into the smoke and destruction. A guard stumbled into his path, coughing, eyes wide with terror, his rifle half raised. Eli struck before the man could react, his fist crashing into his throat, a second blow sending him sprawling into the burning wreckage. More men were coming. He could hear their boots slamming against the pavement, their voices barking orders, their weapons raised in desperation. Moreno would feel this. But the crime boss wasn't a man who let an attack go unanswered. The retaliation came faster than Eli expected. He had barely made it to his safe house when the first bullet shattered the window, spraying glass across the room in a deadly rain. He hit the floor as the second round buried itself into the wall behind him, the dull thud of suppressed gunfire filling the space. They weren't street thugs this time. They moved too clean, too precise, their approach methodical, their weapons professional. Moreno had sent his best. Eli rolled behind the couch, his gun drawn, his mind calculating exit points, escape routes, weaknesses in their assault. Two were closing in from the front, another taking position near the fire escape. A fourth man, unseen but present, waiting for a mistake. Eli didn't give them one. He moved fast, his body a blur of motion as he pivoted, his first shot punching through the chest of the nearest attacker before the man even had time to register what had happened. The second fired, the muzzle flash cutting through the dark, but Eli was already gone, sliding behind cover as the bullet embedded into the floor where he had just been. The third man tried to flank him, moving low, but Eli anticipated it, stepping into his attack, using the man's own momentum to slam him into the counter before driving a knife into his ribs. The last one hesitated, his breath audible in the tense silence, his grip tightening on his pistol. Eli met his gaze, the moment stretching, the weight of it thick between them. Then Eli fired first. He stood in the wreckage of his own sanctuary, blood pooling around his feet, the scent of gunpowder heavy in the air. Moreno knew now. This wasn't just some lone vigilante looking for revenge. This was war. And the crime boss wasn't going to play defense anymore. The call went out. The bounty was set. Eli's name passed between men like a whispered curse, a warning, a promise. He wasn't just another problem to be handled. He was the problem. And when men like Moreno couldn't control something, they destroyed it. That was why the next move wasn't aimed at Eli himself. The message arrived at dawn. A photo. The front door of his mother's house, wide open, the furniture overturned, the shattered remnants of a life once peaceful. No bodies. No blood. But that was worse. They had taken her. Moreno had taken his mother. Eli stared at the image, his fingers curling into fists, his jaw clenching so tight it hurt. The war wasn't just his anymore. It was personal. And he would burn the entire city down to get her back. The house was silent when Eli arrived, the kind of silence that carried weight, thick and unnatural, the absence of life louder than any gunshot. The front door hung open, the frame splintered where it had been forced, the floor littered with broken glass and the scattered remains of furniture overturned in the struggle. His mother's chair was knocked to the side, the lamp beside it shattered, her favorite blanket still draped over the armrest, untouched, as if whoever had taken her hadn't cared about the small details of her life, only about using her to break him. He stepped inside, his breath measured, his pulse steady, but beneath the surface, something darker coiled, something waiting to be unleashed. He scanned the room, eyes moving with precision, picking up the details others would have missed. No blood, no bodies, no sign of a struggle that had gone too far. That meant they had wanted her alive. That meant they had a plan. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The message was simple. A video file. No words, no threats in text. Just the play button waiting for him to press it. He exhaled, knowing what was coming, knowing that Moreno wanted him to see, wanted to crawl into his head and sink his hooks deep. He hit play. The screen flickered to life, grainy footage from a dimly lit room. His mother sat in a chair, hands tied behind her back, her expression calm but sharp, her posture straight, defiant even in the face of fear. Behind her, a man in a ski mask stood with a knife, the edge glinting under the low light. The voice came next, distorted through a filter, but Eli didn't need the theatrics to know who it was. Moreno didn't need to show his face to make his message clear. You took from me, Harris. Now I take from you. You want her back? You come alone. You kneel. Or she dies. The screen cut to black. Eli let the phone fall to his side, his grip tightening until his knuckles went white, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. Moreno thought he could break him, thought he could pull the strings and watch him dance, thought he could force him into submission like all the other men who had bent under his weight. He was wrong. He moved fast, tracking every lead, calling in every favor, pulling at every thread until the picture formed in front of him like a map drawn in blood. The old factory. It made sense. Isolated. Secure. A place where Moreno had done his dirtiest work, where bodies had disappeared, where deals had been sealed in death and silence. It was where the cartel met, where shipments were moved, where power was exchanged in briefcases and unmarked crates. It was where they were keeping her. But this wasn't just about getting her back. This was about making sure Moreno never did this again. He set up the camera, the red light blinking as he stared into the lens, his face unreadable, his voice cold, sharp, final. Moreno, you made a mistake. You thought you could touch what's mine and walk away. You thought fear was your weapon. You forgot who you're dealing with. He leaned in, his dark eyes steady, the weight of his words pressing through the screen. You let her go, or I burn you to the ground. You know I will. He hit send. Then he turned to the only people he trusted. Rob was already waiting, his arms crossed, his expression grim, understanding the weight of what came next. The others followed, men who had once fought beside him, men who owed him, men who knew that when Eli Harris made a promise, he kept it. This wasn't just a rescue. This was the beginning of the end. The factory loomed ahead, a decaying husk of rusted steel and cracked concrete, its skeletal remains swallowed by darkness, its past buried beneath the weight of the crimes committed within. Eli crouched low behind the outer fence, his breath steady, his body coiled like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Rob signaled from the other side, 3 fingers raised, 3 guards on patrol, rotating every 90 seconds. The others moved into position, silent shadows slipping between blind spots, their presence as unnoticed as the wind cutting through the cold air. The plan was simple: get in, get to his mother, and burn everything Moreno had built to the ground. The first guard never saw the knife coming. The blade slid under his ribs, severing breath before sound could escape, his body lowered gently to the ground, disappearing into the dark. The second barely had time to register movement before Eli's hand clamped over his mouth, twisting his neck with brutal precision, the sharp pop lost beneath the distant hum of machinery. The third turned, eyes widening in alarm, finger twitching toward the trigger of his rifle, but Rob was faster, his silencer whispering death as the man crumpled where he stood. Inside, the scent of oil, sweat, and blood clung to the air. Dim overhead lights flickered against rusted catwalks, casting fractured shadows across rows of steel crates. Eli moved first, his body slipping between the labyrinth of stacked cargo, every step calculated, every movement a reminder of years spent perfecting the art of war. Then the alarm tripped. The sound was sharp, shrill, slicing through the stillness like a blade. Lights flared to full power, the shadows ripped away in an instant, and from the far end of the warehouse, Moreno's elite fighters emerged, weapons raised, their postures rigid with the confidence of men who had never lost a fight. These weren't street-level thugs. These were killers. Hardened, ruthless, efficient. But they weren't him. The first shot cracked through the air, missing Eli by inches as he rolled behind cover, returning fire with brutal precision. The nearest mercenary jerked backward, his chest cavity caving under the force of a hollow-point round. The second rushed forward, his knife flashing under the artificial glow, but Eli sidestepped, catching the wrist mid-swing, twisting with enough force to snap bone before driving his own blade into the exposed throat. Blood sprayed across the concrete. The others hesitated for just a second, but that was all he needed. He moved through them like a storm tearing through brittle structures, every strike breaking bodies, every shot finding its mark. Rob covered his flank, their movements a deadly rhythm honed by instinct, by experience, by the kind of violence that had long since become second nature. Then silence. The bodies lay still, the metallic scent of blood thick in the air. Eli wiped the sweat from his brow, his muscles burning from exertion, but there was no time to stop. He had one objective left. He found her in a locked room, her wrists bound, her posture rigid but unbroken, her eyes fierce even as exhaustion lined her face. Relief flickered in her gaze the moment she saw him, but it was fleeting. The door slammed open behind him. The enforcer was built like a machine, his presence radiating lethal intent, his fists wrapped in blood-stained bandages, his knuckles scarred from years of breaking men apart. No hesitation. No warning. The first blow came fast, a hammer of force that Eli barely dodged, the air slicing past his cheek as the impact shattered the doorframe behind him. He countered, aiming for the ribs, but the man absorbed it, grinning through the pain, his next strike landing solidly against Eli's side, sending a shockwave through his ribs. The fight was raw, brutal, neither man giving an inch. Every hit was a calculated attempt to end it, no wasted movement, no room for error. Eli feinted left, then drove his elbow into the enforcer's throat, using the moment of staggered breath to shift his weight and sweep the man's leg out from under him. He landed hard, but before he could rise, Eli's knee slammed into his skull. Twice. 3 times. The body went still. He turned to his mother, cutting her bindings with a swift flick of his blade. She touched his face, fingers brushing against the bruises already forming. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice rough, his body aching, but there was no time for rest. The war wasn't over. Not yet. The bounty spread like wildfire, whispered in backrooms, scrawled onto burner phones, slipping through the underbelly of the city like a disease infecting desperate men. 50 grand for Eli Harris, dead or alive. Moreno wasn't playing games anymore. The moment the news hit the streets, the hunt began. Hitmen, ex-cons, street soldiers with nothing to lose, every man with a gun and a grudge was suddenly tracking his movements, hoping to cash in before the next guy. Eli knew it wasn't just about money. It was about power. About making an example of him. About reminding the city that no one could challenge Moreno and walk away breathing. But something was shifting. The people had seen what Eli had done, what he was willing to do, and the fear that had ruled them for years was starting to crack. It started small, a gas station owner refusing to pay protection money, a local mechanic locking his doors on Moreno's men instead of servicing their vehicles. Then it escalated. Storefronts that had once been too afraid to speak out now refused to comply. Neighbors started looking out for each other, sharing names, reporting movements, disrupting operations. They had spent years swallowing their fear, bending their backs under the weight of corruption, but now they had seen what resistance looked like, and they weren't willing to kneel anymore. Moreno knew it too. He could feel the city shifting under him, the cracks forming in the foundation he had spent decades cementing. That was why he struck back. Eli was moving between safe houses when the betrayal hit. The moment he stepped into the warehouse, he felt it. Something was wrong. Too quiet. Too controlled. Then Rob was there, his face tight, his shoulders tense, his hand resting too casually on his hip. Eli had known Rob too long not to recognize the weight of guilt pressing behind his eyes. "You led me here," Eli said, voice low, not a question, just a statement of fact. Rob exhaled, running a hand over his face, eyes flickering toward the shadows just beyond the crates. "I didn't have a choice." Eli moved first. The bullet snapped through the air just as he rolled, the sniper's shot barely missing his shoulder. Rob dove for cover, torn between the deal he had made and the man he had just tried to set up. Eli didn't give him time to decide. He fired twice, clipping one of the advancing mercenaries, then sprinted toward the exit as gunfire erupted behind him, bullets slamming into steel and cement, ricocheting through the air in a storm of metal and heat. The city was waiting for him outside, but not the city he had known. Streets burned. People screamed. The war had spilled out of the shadows, exploding into full-blown chaos. Gangs loyal to Moreno clashed with citizens who had had enough, makeshift barricades blocking intersections, gunfire echoing through alleyways as small factions rose up, determined to carve their own futures out of the destruction. Cars burned in the distance, the glow of fire flickering against the high-rises, casting long, violent shadows across the concrete battlefield. The bounty had turned the city into a free-for-all. Any thug with a weapon was taking shots, hoping to be the one who brought Eli down. He ducked behind an overturned van as bullets shattered the glass above his head, his body moving purely on instinct now, every muscle coiled, every movement sharp and deliberate. He turned, fired 3 rounds, dropped 2 men before they could get a proper aim. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Somewhere in the chaos, Moreno was watching his empire unravel. The moment Rob's betrayal had been revealed, it was only a matter of time before the others turned. Fear could only hold men for so long before desperation made them dangerous. The first defection came from his second-in-command, a lieutenant who had seen enough to know which way the wind was blowing. Then another. Then another. Moreno had ruled the city through fear. But now, with fire in the streets and his own men abandoning him, the fear was no longer his weapon. It was his prison. And Eli was coming for him. Moreno sat in the heart of his fortress, his grand estate that had once been a symbol of untouchable power, now a crumbling relic of an empire on its last breath. The city outside was lost to him. The streets burned with rebellion, his men abandoned him one by one, their loyalty shattered the moment they realized fear was no longer enough to hold them. Those who remained weren't staying for devotion, only desperation. Ex-military, mercenaries, the kind of killers who didn't have anywhere else to go. They knew there was no way out. If they ran, they were dead. If they stayed, they were dead. The only choice left was to take as many down with them as they could. Eli stood at the edge of the estate, watching from the tree-line, rain dripping down his face, muscles taut as he studied the grounds. Security had been thinned. The outer patrols were gone. The front gates were wide open, but not as an invitation. Moreno wanted him inside. A trap, obvious and crude, but it didn't matter. Eli had come this far, and there was only one way this ended. He adjusted his grip on the silenced pistol, exhaling slowly as he moved forward. The first kill was swift. A guard pacing too far from the main entrance, his throat cut before he even registered a shadow moving behind him. The second was Messier, a man standing by the doors, shotgun slung over his shoulder. Eli snapped his wrist, yanked the weapon free, turned it on its owner, and silenced him with a single blast to the chest. The echo of the shot barely faded before alarms blared through the estate, heavy steel shutters slamming over the windows as men scrambled into position. They were waiting for him now, weapons aimed at the staircases, at the hallways, at every possible entrance. But Eli had never been one for obvious approaches. He moved through the walls like a ghost, taking them out one by one, moving faster than they could track, slipping between cover, using their own blind spots against them. A flash of movement, a broken wrist, a knife sliding between ribs. His breath came steady, his pulse calm, his body operating on the cold precision of a man who had been built for war. By the time he reached the upper floor, the grand hallway was littered with bodies, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood and gunpowder. And then it was just the two of them. Moreno stood at the far end of the room, a glass of whiskey in one hand, a pistol in the other, his once pristine suit stained with sweat and smoke. He didn't look afraid. He looked resigned. "You really think this changes anything?" Moreno's voice was low, almost amused, like a man who had long since accepted his fate. "Someone else will take my place." "Someone worse?" Eli didn't answer. He just kept walking, closing the distance between them, his gun steady at his side. Moreno moved first. The gun snapped up, a shot cracked through the air, but Eli had already shifted, the bullet grazing past his shoulder. He closed in, grabbed the weapon, twisted. Bones snapped. The gun clattered to the floor. Then it was fists, raw and brutal, years of rage and vengeance poured into every strike. Eli's knuckles met Moreno's ribs, his jaw, his throat, his vision turning red as he drove the crime lord to his knees. Moreno coughed blood, his body broken, his breath ragged. He looked up, smiling through the pain. "Go ahead. Do it." Eli raised the gun, stared down the barrel, his finger hovering over the trigger. One pull. 1 second. It would all be over. But then he thought of his mother, of the people fighting in the streets, of what kind of man he would be if he chose vengeance over justice. Slowly he lowered the weapon. Not like this, he muttered, turning away as the sound of sirens filled the night. The police swarmed in moments later, dragging Moreno away, his screams of rage echoing through the halls. The empire was done. The city was free. But Eli knew the war was never truly over. There would always be another Moreno. Another battle. And he would always be there to fight it. The city was breathing again, but it was the kind of breath that came after a storm, ragged and uncertain, filled with the weight of everything that had been lost. The streets bore the scars of war, burned-out cars, shattered windows, the lingering stench of smoke and gunpowder. The people who had once walked in fear now stood in the open, watching as the last remnants of Moreno's empire were dragged away in handcuffs or carried out in body bags. It was over, at least for now. Eli stood at the center of it all, his body aching, his mind numb, watching as the sun broke through the dark clouds overhead. He had won, but victory never came without a price. His mother, bruised but alive, wrapped her arms around him, whispering that it was time to go, that they could leave this place behind, that they could find somewhere safe. But Eli knew better. The war wasn't over, not really. Men like Moreno didn't just disappear. They left ghosts. They left seeds of corruption buried deep in the cracks of the city, waiting for the right moment to rise again. He had seen it before, in different places, under different names. A new face would take over. Another greedy hand would reach for power. Another monster would crawl out from the shadows, thinking they could own these streets just like the last one. And if Eli left now, there would be no one left to stop it. The first warning came before the bodies were even cold. A drive-by shooting in the south side, a message scrawled in blood across the pavement. Moreno may be dead, but we are not. His lieutenants were still out there, men who had built their lives around the empire he created, men who had lost everything and had nothing left but revenge. They wouldn't let go without a fight. They wanted the city back. And they wanted Eli's head on a spike. He moved before they could, tracked them down in the ruins of their old hideouts, one by one, like hunting animals in the dark. No speeches. No warnings. Just the swift, brutal certainty that they had already lost. Some ran. Some begged. Some fought like cornered rats, desperate and wild. But none of them walked away. By the time the city woke the next morning, the war had been settled. There would be no second coming of Moreno's empire. Still, the city was not the same. Justice, real justice, was a fragile thing, something people only believed in when it was convenient. The cops who had worked for Moreno were either dead or behind bars, but others had taken their place, men in suits who smiled for the cameras while making quiet deals in the back rooms. The streets were calmer, but they were still bleeding. The people who had suffered under Moreno weren't celebrating, they were waiting. Waiting to see if things would really change. Waiting to see if Eli would stay. His mother pleaded with him one last time. They could go anywhere. Start over. Find a place where no one knew his name, where he didn't have to keep fighting, where he could just live. He wanted to believe her. Wanted to close his eyes and pretend that was possible. But deep down he knew the truth. Men like him didn't get to walk away. The moment he left, the moment he turned his back, the darkness would crawl back in. Someone had to stand guard. Someone had to make sure the monsters stayed buried. So he stayed. Not because he wanted to. Not because he had nowhere else to go. But because it was the only thing that made sense. He had seen what this city could be when fear ruled it. And he wasn't going to let that happen again. As the last traces of smoke faded into the sky and the city settled into an uneasy peace, Eli Harris walked into the night, knowing that his war was far from over. It would never be over. But as long as he was still breathing, the city would never belong to the monsters again.